Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard the Wright Flyer. I'm Randy Wright, and I'll be your captain on this solo flight special edition of our state-of-the-art radio program. Folks, this will be the final boarding call, so if you please, claim your seats, fasten your seat belts, kick back, relax, and enjoy the show while I go ahead and delve into the pre-flight checklist, as there really is a lot of news and information to get to before I may fully indulge you with your in-flight entertainment. Well, folks, here we are. Because when we look at what's happening in the United States of America today, I'm sure that many of us are wondering how it is that we got to such a stage of divisiveness, to a period within our nation's relatively brief yet illustrious history where we have allowed ourselves to be led astray. Not just led astray, but the fact that we have forgotten what it is to be American citizens. I don't mean that as a swipe against the American people. Far from it. I think that the whole issue of what we're facing right now is something that cannot be ignored, something that continues to be a major problem, a catastrophe of the worst order. And that is something that I think we have to address, both as a nation and as a people. It's something that has let us down and has basically placed us at each other's throats, so that we are so divided that we no longer see what the commonalities are between ourselves as a nation and as a people. And I think that that literally does place us in a precarious position. And I think one of the things that we need to take away is, as we are headed into this holiday season, we have to consider who we are as a nation and as a people. We have to take a step back and recall what it is that propelled us to such lofty heights in our relatively brief yet illustrious history here on God's green earth. And that has always been, as my first officer Jeremy Grapenton has oft-times reiterated on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, the overarching aspect of our fundamental and inalienable rights that were handed down unto us by our Creator, the God of nature himself. It's amazing when you stop and think about it, just how fortunate we are as a nation and as a people, how we have managed for over 2 centuries to maintain our representative Republican form of government. And that is not by fluke. It's not by happenstance. It's not just something that happened as a freak of nature or some twisting aspect of fate. No, what happened here is the sagacity and near infinite wisdom and foresight of our founding fathers. So the question then becomes, as we sit here and look back at what has happened to this country, when did we start to change? When did we start to lose sight of our common virtues as a nation and as a people, and start focusing on insular and discrete minorities, as it's called in the legal parlance, or these disparate and competing factions that, as we have oftentimes mentioned, George Washington, the father of our country, warned about, going back to the inception of our country, and back to his his farewell address, where he was saying that if we do break down into these disparate and competing factions, then we lose sight of the greater good, the overarching commonalities that draw us together, the kinship that exists between us in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty. I believe that it really started in earnest in the 1960s with the rise of the so-called counterculture. The countercultural revolution was designed by a nefarious group of frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists who had it in their mind that what we needed to do in this nation was to abandon the time-honored principles and the core values and convictions that led us to such lofty heights in our relatively brief yet illustrious history, and to embrace something that has failed every time it's ever been tried, and that is socialism. Everywhere we turn in the globe, we see that socialism is an abject failure, that it never accomplishes what it says it will do. And then when you combine that with cultural Marxism, it literally leaves us in a dangerous position. And because of that, they push to overwhelm the system, going back to that whole Cloward and Piven principle, devised by those egghead academicians, Cloward and Piven, who were in Columbia University. They were professors at Columbia University during the 1950s and 60s. And their entire goal, the entire modus operandi behind what they were doing, was to overwhelm the system to create a permanent welfare system. Well, the cultural Marxists took it a step further. They took it to the step of attacking our cultural traditions, our institutions, our time-honored values, because they realized that just approaching it from economics meant that they could not drastically change the nation and drastically promote their dark and twisted machinations and agenda as they had hoped. And therefore, what they really needed to do was to push us down a path to a place where we could not survive, to a place where our goals would fall apart and wither on the vine, so that they could then say, see, those evil, racist, homophobic, sexist white guys that were slaveholders, they really didn't have an understanding of liberty. They really didn't have an understanding of what we're facing, both as a nation and as a people, and therefore, we need to just discard everything that they said. And so they've done this through historical revisionism in our institutions of education from coast to coast and border to border. They've done it by getting a stranglehold over our information media sources and outlets, and they have refused to look back. They have refused to abandon that, and they have just doubled down on their efforts to fundamentally, drastically, and dare I say detrimentally redefine us, taking us away from being a constitutionally endowed federalist representative republic and turning us into a frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftist dystopia that truly has no place in an open and honest, but above all free society like that of these United States of America. And so when we stop and look at that, and when we consider what it is that they have done and what it is that they are continuing to do, we have to wonder whether we can ever regain this notion of there being a greater good in the United States, as to whether we can ever get back to being the virtuous republic that Founding Fathers Sam Adams said that we had to be in order to thrive and in order to flourish. And I believe that the answer to those rhetorical questions is open and obvious. It's yes, we can get back to being the robust nation that we were always intended to be. We can get back to who we are supposed to be, but it is going to take some soul searching. It is going to take a deliberate and concerted effort on the part of we the people as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours. But that is always so much easier said than done. These abstract principles are always easier to be conveyed in words, but when it comes to deliberate action, it's more difficult. When it comes to standing up for our time-honored values, principles, and institutions, it's more difficult. And it's certainly more difficult when you consider that part of what makes conservatism more piecemeal, for lack of a better term, is the fact that we are free, independent thinkers, that we are ruggedly individual, and therefore it's very difficult for us to organize because, like our founding fathers, we share this inherent distrust of centralized and consolidated power. We see that as being a force of negativity, something that strips and deprives us of the fundamental and inalienable God-given rights that are everything to us. And again, that's part of the reason why our first officer, Jeremy Grapington, and our first Air Marshal, Mr. Nelson Ward, say that when you don't have your rights, and when you don't live up to support those rights, then you are essentially left with nothing. It strips and deprives you of your humanity. It strips and deprives you of your ability to live your own life. And one of the things that we take away from the traditional approach to this holiday, to Christmas, to the New Year's, to this time of inner reflection, is that we can't just focus solely on the individual. That there has to be a balance, that there has to be this greater good, this overarching greater good that we seek to achieve, that we seek to build up, that thereby makes us stronger and more robust as a nation and as a people. And part of the problem ever since the countercultural revolution and the rise of charlatans such as Saul Alinsky, who drafted their Bible, the rules for radicals, is that they basically got rid of this whole notion, this unifying notion that the supreme law of the land, which pursuant to Article 6, Clause 2 of our shared United States Constitution, is the Constitution itself. That's the supremacy clause that says that. They got rid of that notion of the law defining us, of the United States being a nation of laws and not of men, and they swept it under the rug. And they essentially push this whole notion of, well, you have to go down the Timothy Leary, is what? Tune in, drop out, have LSD. I mean, Timothy Leary was quite the character. And he was famous for saying, tune in, turn on, drop out. It was all about just embracing the perversions of society, of becoming something that we were never intended to be. And it was all about experimentation back in 1966 or so of LSD. They wanted to escape reality. The youth felt that they were being abused by a corrupt culture that didn't give a damn about their sufferings, and it centered around the whole Vietnam War. Because the Gulf of Tonkin incident was something that was orchestrated by a frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftist LBJ to get what he wanted. And he coupled that with a great society and things like that in order to embrace the hippie mentality that the countercultural revolution was all about, that Timothy Leary and people of that ilk were pushing for, and that was trying to set a whole new narrative in the United States. And this is something that's not really heard much anymore. It's not something discussed anymore, but it was a drastic shift in culture. And I've actually got a short clip of Leary essentially going forth and doing that speech. And I'm going to go ahead and key that up now, folks, because I think it's important for us to reflect upon that and then discuss in further detail just how it is that we are falling away from what it is that we are as a nation and as a people, and how it is that we have gotten away from that. And I'm going to go ahead and get this going right now. I'm going to switch over.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out. out of high school, drop out of college, drop out of graduate school, junior executive, drop out of senior executive, turn on, tune in, drop out.
That was his message. That was his message. He was pushing this whole diatribe of essentially give up on your hopes and dreams. Stop being the robust people that you were always meant to be. Just give up. Just give in to these desires, to these unworldly feelings that take you away from being responsible for yourself, essentially stripping and depriving you of that drive that is quintessentially American. And that quintessentially American drive is that our entire nation is built upon the twin notions of self-responsibility and self-accountability working in tandem to self-determination. That is who we are as a nation and as a people. That is how we managed to be a robust people. That is how we managed to overcome all of the hurdles, adversities, and obstacles that had been placed in our path during our relatively brief yet illustrious history. And yes, it was difficult. It is difficult. It is always difficult to be in control of the critical aspects of your life. That's not something that is easily accomplished. That's not something for the faint of heart, but the American people and this experiment in a representative Republican form of government was not designed to be easy. It was designed to allow us to exercise our fundamental and inalienable rights, which were endowed to us by our Creator, the God of nature himself, without fear of governmental encroachment and recrimination. And that was truly unique. That was new. And the countercultural revolution had come to the conclusion that it had failed, that this entire system was an abject failure that didn't work, that it was just abusing people, and was designed to exploit people, to divide and conquer. But what they were really doing there, folks, was they were looking at the projections that were being put forth by the agent provocateurs of the Fabian socialist movement, people like Saul Alinsky. Alinsky had gone forth and said, you know, you've got to work within the system, to polarize the system, to basically mold the system to fit what you want. You have to be an alternative to the more radical elements of the left. And we're talking about the Marxists that wanted violent revolution, because when you go back and look at pure Marxist ideology, when you look at the Communist Manifesto and Marx's dialectic, it said that the only way that communism could ever truly be achieved was if that system embraced a violent revolution, a violent overthrow of what existed before. And of course, that always played out in the way that communism was implemented. Now, the purists, particularly the academicians that have been teaching about Marxism in the ivory towers of education, try and say, well, it's because the wrong people have tried to implement it. And they were doing it the wrong way. They weren't focusing on the true critical aspects of Marxism. And therefore, it couldn't work. It can't work when it's done the wrong way. But that's the thing. When you look at the very nature and the inherent flaws that are an intrinsic part of Marxism, any form of Marxism, You see that it cannot work with human nature because people will always have ambition. And government workers are not godmen. They are just plain human beings. They will not lose that ambitious drive that they have. And therefore, it is naive, to say the least, that if every nation on earth became communist, then suddenly in this workers' paradise, this quote-unquote utopia, which draws its root word from Greek, meaning no place, cannot exist, then the governments will just wither on the vine, and all of a sudden these people will magically give up their ambitions. Think about that for a moment, folks. Does that make any sense whatsoever? No. It doesn't, because it is adverse to, contradictory to, the natural law tenets or the natural order of things that drives people and that is inscribed on our hearts. You see, the natural law is a philosophical doctrine. It means that it is something that can be universally understood by the fundamental application of logic and reason. And yes, there is a bit of a religious connotation to that, because when you stop and think about it, what is it in Scripture that supposedly separates mankind from all of God's creations? It's free will. That means logic. That means reasoning. That means being able to apply our mental faculties to come to a better, more absolute, albeit flawed, understanding of the way the world works, of the way that human society works, of how we interact with one another, and how we proceed. And you see, when you go against that, when you try and teach that that is meaningless, that is when you begin to encounter problems. That's why communism fails. That's why it has to be implemented with a heavy hand. And therefore, any doctrine or any understanding that either predates the communist system that is forcibly being implemented must be eradicated. That's why under Mao, you had the beginnings of the Cultural Revolution, in which they went about and tried to destroy the pre-existing history of China. Of course, there's an interesting story that comes out of that is part of the dark and twisted days of World War II. During World War II, we know that it was in the Pacific Theater, started with what was known as the Second Sino-Japanese War, meaning the Second Chinese-Japanese War that had started in the 30s. And the Kuomintang, which was the Chinese nationalists, which is now the government of Taiwan, under the leadership of Chiang Kai-shek, was trying to push back the Japanese. And the communist Chinese, Red China, under Mao, had temporarily put aside their differences to fight a common enemy. The Japanese, however, saw the opportunity to implement a puppet regime. And the Japanese, still having their emperor, decided that they should put up the last living Chinese emperor of the Manchu dynasty, meaning from the Manchurians, one Henry Puyi, in a puppet state called Manchukuo. Basically, the Manchurian areas and some of the lands that the Japanese had controlled since they defeated the Russians in the Russian-Japanese War of 1905 and 6, they put that up to say, essentially, that they were fighting for Chinese independence, for the re-establishment of the rightful monarchy. That was how they went about their fascist regime. That's how they attempted to use the tenets of propaganda to push forth a narrative that was not based in reality. Well, Puyi had spent 10 years after the war in a Chinese prison, essentially a re-education camp. And then he was used as a propaganda tool by Mao and the quote-unquote People's Republic of China to add credence, credibility, and legitimacy to the communist regime. But when the Cultural Revolution started and when Mao's student brigades, as part of that whole Iron Rice Bowl philosophy that he was trying to cram down the throats of the Chinese, rose up against all things that harkened back to the Chinese Empire, he had to protect Puyi. Because Puyi became a target as the last vestige, as the last remnant of the old empire of China. And that made him an easy target. Essentially, it made him political and propagandistic fodder for those forces that were pushing forth with the narrative of Mao Zedong. And so, essentially, this reformed Henry Puyi had become a puppet whose usefulness had ended. And so Mao stripped him of his property like he did everyone else. He provided him with protection, but it caused Puyi's health to deteriorate, and he died shortly thereafter. And there's a valuable lesson to be taken away from that. When you are used as a pawn by the charlatans, the hucksters, the carnival barkers, the con artists, the snake oil salesmen, who are just essentially moving forward with an agenda that they refuse to back away from, then you are essentially falling by the wayside. You are losing your self-identity. You are becoming a tool, a cog in the wheel of a machine that ultimately disregards your humanity and your individualism. And that's one of the main reasons that Jeremy and I, on previous episodes of Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have reiterated this point, that you just don't allow yourself to be whipped up into a state of hysteria. You don't allow yourself to be propelled to such a state of raw emotionalism that you become susceptible to these sorts of dark and twisted machinations. Because when you allow yourself to fall into that kind of trap, it is never something that ends in your favor. It is never something that will benefit you or the nation. And so that leads us up to the other part of the title for today's Solo Flight Special, and that is, what is the true meaning of constitutionalism? The true meaning of constitutionalism is another understanding with respect to philosophy. It goes back to John Locke's ideas of a social contract. And of course, the Constitution is the greatest social compact or contract ever devised by the hands of men, yet divinely inspired by providence above. It defines us, it allows us to work as a cohesive nation and as a people, and it ensures our liberties. For you see, our liberties are not given to us by government. They are inherent, they are natural, they are a critical aspect of who we are. And if you say that the government gave you these rights, then that same government can obliterate, strip, abridge, and deny you those rights. And our founding fathers, in all of their sagacity and their near infinite wisdom and foresight, fully recognized this, were fully cognizant of this. And so they did everything they could to ensure that those rights would be maintained and safeguarded. They did everything within their power to empower we the people. Of course, that is seen by the near poetic, the beautiful language that is contained in the opening lines to the preamble of our shared Constitution. We the people, in order to establish a more perfect union, to ensure the domestic tranquility, to secure the blessings of liberty for our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution. Again, that was an active step, a proactive step on the part of we the people. It was ours, not the politicians, not these nefarious forces that were doing everything in their power to cause us to be opposed to one another, to cause us to basically fall down the path of divide and conquer, because that is always the tactic and strategy that the frothing at the mouth Fabian socialist leftists embrace. No, we had to see something greater than that. And that draws us right back to the point I was making at the opening of this Solo Flight special. And that is that the countercultural revolution sought to undermine those pillars, those fundamental quintessential pillars of Americana, so that they could then replace it with the type of division and hatred and animus that we see on a daily basis, ailing and afflicting us. The societal blight wrought by the twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism are directly tied in to this meticulous, relentless, and tireless effort. It is all designed to destroy all that we hold near and dear. It is essentially being pushed forward as a false narrative to alienate each and every one of us in our capacity as the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this once thriving and flourishing representative republic of ours. And so we see that identity politics comes in. And all of a sudden, the socialist elites that have certainly wielded the reins of political power in this nation for the last 8 years, or under the two disastrous terms of this Barack Hussein Obama regime, they have gone forth and they have carved out a special niche for themselves, essentially claiming that the laws don't apply to them. And when we reflect upon this long journey, this bruising journey that was the 2016 presidential election cycle, we come to the ultimate realization of what it was that we were facing and what it was that drove people to turn against Hillary Rotten Clinton was the fact that she essentially exuded that principle. She essentially came forth and allowed herself to skate above the law, but it wasn't just she herself that was allowing this. It was the entire edifice and the corrupt apparatus of our government in its current state and form. And as a direct consequence from this, we see that it has placed us in the untenable situation that we are in now, that it accelerated the raging bonfire that threatened to ignite and set aflame all of our rights and liberties. And that required, in order to truly bring this nation back from the brink of ruin, it required that we be cognizant of the dangers that were there. But we had allowed ourselves to shut down our mental faculties and had stopped thinking of the greater good, had stopped thinking of the one true aspect that unites us, both as a nation and as a people, and began to just seek vengeance. We wanted to pour fuel on the fire to destroy it because we had allowed ourselves to be convinced that we could somehow begin anew, that we could restore the nation by destroying the nation, which makes absolutely no sense when you apply logic to it. But when you have been whipped up into a state of hysteria, it doesn't work. It fails each and every time. And that has been the lingering problem that has faced us. And going back to the example of Puyi, we see that Donald Trump had convinced people that, hey, finally, we might get some justice. We can finally see a light at the end of the tunnel. And maybe, just maybe, that means that we will finally stick it to these elitists that have been thumbing their noses at us for generation after successive generation. That was the hope. That was certainly the message that he was peddling while on the campaign trail. And it makes me want to play a clip from about 2 months ago where Trump was in Pennsylvania, and during which we saw the push to have the Vengeance Brigade go forth, essentially, and redefine the political narrative, the attributes of vengeance politics, all of those things. And I'm going to cue this up, and then we'll discuss it further. So here we go.
And I'll bet you they are sick to their stomachs at what's happening. Sick to their stomachs. Anyway, her emails were destroyed somewhere between March 25th and March 31st after the congressional subpoena was received. You know, if you're suing somebody privately and they delete and get rid of all your stuff that you subpoena, you got a very big consequence. You know what the consequence is, right? Here's the United States Congress subpoenaing emails and other things, and they're gone. And now, by the way, did you read yesterday? 2 boxes of emails and materials are now missing. Okay? Very, very sad.
Yeah, it's sad, but it's not as sad as the other thing that happened there. It's not as sad as what we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have been warning about since last year, for 1 year and 3 months now. It's that he wouldn't stand by this, that he would walk this back as he walked back every promise that he made while on the campaign trail. Because, again, the people had allowed themselves to be whipped up into this raw state of emotionalism. They allowed themselves to believe that they could seek out a messianic figure, and that by turning to some messianic figure, we could bring this nation back onto the path to prosperity. That was their goal. That's what they hoped. That is literally what they thought would be achieved, and they were unwilling to listen to any other thing because their mind had been brought to that position. They had been whipped up into that hysteria, and nothing else mattered. The dangers of a cult of personality were completely unleashed upon the United States, but in particular with the gutless opposition party, or GOP. And the détente wing saw this as the perfect opportunity to root out true, dyed-in-the-wool constitutional compositionists, to essentially that, you know what? You are not welcome in this party anymore. You have no place in the Republican Party anymore because we don't like conservatism. And part of the reason that Jeremy and I have named not just the election cycle, but the entire year of 2016 as that of the year and election cycle of betrayal is because you used to have pundits and commentators on the right, people like Rush Limbaugh in particular, who said that we're going to stick it to the quote-unquote establishment because the establishment are acting in a way as though they are embarrassed by the base of their party, that they will do anything to distance and divorce themselves from the true spine and backbone of their party, and that is why we lost in 2008, and it's why we lost in 2012. But here's the thing. Trump is not the outsider that he claims to be. Like Mao, who played Emperor Henry Puyi, he convinced the base of the party that what he was doing was looking out for their best interests, that he was building this great movement, that we should just ignore the alleged alt-right or alternative right, what we call the alt-Reich, because they are not a big movement. It goes right back to George Orwell's magnum opus of 1984, where they used that political double speech and doublespeak in order to implement a different message, one in which was contradictory. And we recall that included such lines as strength is weakness, individuality is group. In other words, the group is individual. Just things of that nature, where they would take positions that were the direct and polar opposite of what they had been conveying through their information media outlets, Big Brother being, of course, the euphemism he used for government. And the people would just go along with it because they had been conditioned through states of raw emotionalism into accepting that which could only be referred to as unacceptable, for marching down a path where they abandoned their God-given liberties, their individual identity, and essentially became a target for the state. They allowed themselves to be redefined in ways that they should never have been redefined. And of course, that is the same type of danger that we are facing in this nation right now as I sit here speaking into this microphone, conveying this message unto you, our cherished listening passengers and audience members. And so again, it draws us right back into this whole notion of, well, what is constitutionalism? What is the real meaning of that? Why is that so important? It rests at the heart of what this nation is about and has always been about. Unlike the alt-right that wants to sit there and say that nationalism needs to be defined based on this barbaric notion of tribalism, we are a nation of laws and not of men. In other words, we are united not by race, not by gender, not by anything other than the law. And it draws us also back to what Benjamin Franklin provided in his answer to that young woman that ran up to him in the wake of the Constitutional Convention and said, Mr. Franklin, what is it that you have given us? And he replied, a republic if you can keep it. That if, that condition there, falls squarely on the shoulder of we the people in our capacity as citizens, as sovereign citizens, to proactively maintain and safeguard and promote and advocate for our fundamental and inalienable rights which were endowed to us by our Creator, who happens to be none other than the God of nature himself. That is something we cannot back away from. That is something that is at the heart of who we are as a nation and as a people. And so it means, above all else, that we have to continue to strive for that, that we have to continue to work towards that goal, because it is that goal that unifies us and defines us. But when we allow ourselves to be essentially led astray by the charlatans, by the hucksters, by the carnival barkers and con artists and snake oil salesmen, we shut down our mental faculties and don't think about things. Folks, what Trump is wanting is for us to be as reactionary as he is, as impulsive as he is. But reaction and impulse are not the driving forces of these United States of America. The natural law, which, as I previously explained, requires the application of sound logic, sound judgment, and sound reason, is what drives us. It is what pushes this nation to the lofty heights that we have managed to achieve in our relatively brief yet illustrious history here on God's green earth. And so if we turn our backs on that, if we abandon those principles, if we sell out and become shills for a totalitarian type system, then we are abandoning all that has made us who we are. And folks, I just don't think we can afford to do that. I think we could ill afford to do that, particularly when you consider that right now, the United States of America is in the midst of an identity crisis coupled with a slew of constitutional crises. When our government has allowed itself to be so divorced and so far distanced from the Constitution as it is now, that's why the office of President of the United States of America has become such an all-encompassing aspect. It's because the chief executive of these United States of America has been driven to such a position as to have power that was never intended to be handed to one man or one respective branch of government by our founding fathers. You see, what we have now is the direct result and consequence of breaching that social contract that exists between all of us in our capacity as citizens, whether we be natural born or naturalized, and the government. And it also draws us back to why, in the First Amendment to the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments to our shared United States Constitution, it says that we, the people, have the right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. It goes directly to the heart of what our founding fathers were attempting to accomplish with the establishment of this nation some 235 plus years ago. And that is not something that should be taken lightly. Yet we know that the Edmund Kozaks that worked for Laura Inkamp over there at her Wright page, LifeZet, or whatever the hell she calls it, who said that the Constitution is a mere piece of paper. It fully demonstrates to me that he doesn't know the meaningful history of the United States, that he doesn't understand our foundation. He may have a wonderful history degree from the University of Edinburgh in Edinburgh, Scotland, but he has no idea who we are, what we stand for, and what we represent. He's the one that said that constitutional compositionists have mistaken the Constitution for perfection. And he says that we ought to be left out and pushed out of the reins of political power. Well, he's wrong. He is one of the agent provocateurs of division, of identity politics, of the twin cancerous doctrines of political correctness and moral relativism. And that is why he and his ilk supported Donald Trump. They thought that they would get the wall, that Mexico would pay for it. Well, that's been walked back. And they thought that maybe, just maybe, they'd get to lock Hillary up. Now, I know that I played that clip of Trump about 2 months ago, basically just yucking it up with the whole phrase of lock her up, letting his ardent supporters believe that this was a position he supported, that this was something that was an intrinsic part of the message that he was conveying, the message that he would bring forth to the country should he be elected president. And now that he's ultimately been elected president, it's like what he said when he was on Fox and Friends one time. Well, you can't take what I'm saying as written in stone. I'm not president yet. These are mere suggestions. And so many former conservatives who have thrown their lot in with the mafioso Quafioso have said that, well, we got to give him 100 days. He hasn't even been sworn into office yet. We have to reserve judgment. Poppycock, we don't have to reserve diddly squat. He made the promises in order to coax people to vote for him, and that means that those who were rabid cheerleaders for him need to hold him accountable. Irrespective of whether he has assumed the mantle of the office yet, he has already assumed a propagandistic type of position that he's going to do things. Think of the Carrier air conditioning manufacturing deal that is nothing short of crony corporatism. Think of the attack on Lockheed Martin stock or the attack on Boeing stock. All because he is acting like he's already the president. And there's a danger to that too. Because when you stop and think about it, a person does not become president until they have sworn the oath of office. And that oath of office centers around the supreme law of the land, which is none other than our shared United States Constitution. So he can claim that anything he does now that is extra constitutional is okay because he's doing it as a private citizen, except he is also going forth and embracing this notion that he's already president. He's having meetings with foreign diplomats and government officials when he has not been sworn into office yet. This is dangerous. It goes against the well-established precedents of law of these United States of America, and it stands in stark opposition to the clear and concise language contained within the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. And that is why my first officer, Jeremy Grapenden, our first Air Marshal, Mr. Nelson Ward, and I myself have been harping over and over and over again, please hold him accountable. Please use the Constitution as the only litmus test. Please get back to strict adherence to the Constitution at all levels of government. But Trump is not going to do that because by his own admission, he has not once found any inherent or intrinsic value in the Constitution, and therefore he has never once read it from cover to cover. That's why when he was questioned about it, he said that he would support Article 12. There is no Article 12 in the Constitution. It tells me beyond a shadow of a doubt that he has no idea what is even contained in the four corners of our shared United States Constitution. It tells me that he is a reckless and a dangerous blowhard. And we could certainly see that from the way that he went after Texas Senator Ted Cruz's family, with those uncorroborated stories from his dear buddy, his bosom buddy, David Pecker, with the National Enquirer. Just making these ludicrous and outlandish claims. That was reckless and dangerous, and it showed beyond any doubt that he wasn't a virtuous person, that he's not going to live up to the standard that Sam Adams said that we had to in order for our republic to be successful, in order for our republic to flourish, that of being people of good, high moral standing and fiber. No. He is a charlatan that is, by his own admission again, willing to say whatever he needs to say in front of one audience, basically allowing that audience to hear exactly what they want to hear. And then something completely different, whatever will benefit himself politically. And recall that one of the things that Jeremy and I kept pointing to during the primary process was how he had come forth and said that if he managed to lose, it would be a big, beautiful waste of time and money. Not that it would be bad for the American people because his policies would be good for the American people. Not that it would be bad for the American people because the supreme law of the land would not be adhered to, that it would be threatened, that it would be challenged, that it would be encroached upon by Hillary Clinton. No, it was about his money. That's the only thing he gives a flying farouk about. That is not the type of characteristic that gives us bold, fair, reason, and determined leadership. That is what leads us down to the path of totalitarianism, to despotism, to these various things that are not welcome in an open, honest, but above all free society like that of these United States of America. And it is why we will not relent when it comes to saying how important it is for us to be a free, constitutionally guided people. And folks, I know that I played that clip just a few minutes back where Trump had basked in the glory of lock her up, lock her up. You know, we got to lock her up. We're going to lock her up. But no, it wasn't that. It wasn't that he meant it. He meant it at that moment, just for that moment, because he could use it in that moment to bring himself to the pinnacle of power. But here's what he's saying now. Here is the point that he makes now that is so different than everything else he had said before. And it's just shocking, really, because it tells us exactly who he is and what he was pushing.
Donald Trump is seemingly already going back on one of his campaign promises. You'll remember he promised to appoint a special prosecutor to investigate Hillary Clinton for using a private email server that happened during one of the debates. Well, listen to what he said at one of these thank you rallies just last night.
That plays great before the election. Now we don't care.
Yeah, if you couldn't really decipher that, there were chants of lock her up from the audience. And he said, now we don't care. That was before the election. But he is now talking about this so-called war on Christmas and claims that people have stopped.
So look at that. Look at that. He is essentially going forth and doubling down on providing people the stuff they want to hear. He is letting them do and say what he thinks they want to hear, and that will somehow allow him to go forth and to continue with this narrative. Folks, this is no different than what Mao Zedong did to the last emperor of China, Henry Puyi, who wound up being a puppet of not only the Imperial Japanese during the dark days of World War II, but by the Communist Chinese in the immediate aftermath. when we consider the totality of the circumstances of all that has been happening, we must not allow ourselves to become political pawns for these charlatans. That is why we here at Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer, have dedicated ourselves to empowering you, the true ultimate wielders of popular sovereignty in this country, by encouraging you to foster the tools that are necessary to allow you to develop and to encourage and to build upon a fluent and working knowledge and understanding of our shared United States Constitution, and thereby your fundamental and inalienable God-given rights. Because again, those are the only things that matter when it comes down to it. Those are the only things that allow us to be a robust and free nation and people. Now, with that said, it is time for us to begin our descent. I'm going to go ahead and send the flight attendant back with one last round of alcohol. Folks, she's not there to make you a puppet. She's just there to be a puppet, to pour you alcohol. As always, I'm your captain, Randy Wright. I want to thank you for tuning in to our state-of-the-art radio program. Should you have any questions, comments, concerns, or even topic suggestions, please feel free to leave them either here in the comment section at our YouTube page or our Google Plus page or on Facebook. And on top of that, I invite you to follow us at Twitter with the Twitter handle at Radio Aviation EX. One more time, folks, that's at Radio Aviation EX. And there you will find the departure board that lists my personal Twitter account, as well as the personal Twitter account of my first officer, Jeremy Grapenton, the Blogspot account where we put up alternative links to the videos here, as well as audio-only versions of our state-of-the-art radio program, so that you can listen at your own leisure and in the format that you would like. And then there is the Cafe Press account. Folks, we are really in the holiday season now. And if you need last-minute stocking stuffers, the Cafe Press account has all sorts of goodies with our original Radio Aviation Excellence, the Wright Flyer logo on it, our first-class passenger logos on it, or our two Uplifting America logos. Because let's face it, folks, after we have been through such a divisive, heated, contentious, and personalized electoral process as we have throughout this year, America really does kind of need uplifting, and that's what we set out to do, because America is great, not because of Trump, but because of the Constitution and the people that it protects. With that said, folks, we'll see you again next time. Please do take care. We'll see you